when I first saw that, I thought, well, potential for what? And the mischievous part of me wondered about how can we make the most potentially sociopathic person successfully sociopathic? But because we know that, in fact, many people who are sociopathic can be, really sleazebags in their personal life, but when they're at a senior political level, they can actually do quite magnificent things for the whole population. So I think we may allow that possibility to come up. But there is a subtitle, and that is, and be motivated to use your potential to add meaning to your life and contribute to the lives of others. So I think there's probably a priority to the more positive aspects. Now, we all had school reports, didn't we, saying that we were failing to fulfill our potential. I cannot think that anyone in this audience wouldn't have had it. And what is this ineffable goal that we were being encouraged to try to achieve, and which we continually encourage others? We know wonderful exemplars of people who flowered later. I mean, Winston Churchill, one of many, many examples, the man who was rated the dumbest boy in his year at Harrow, went on and got a Nobel Prize and did a few other magnificent things. So, very good exemplar of somebody whose potential was realised, or multiple potential was realised later. So, the first issue that I'd like to ask the panel, and this is, the panel is going to be unstructured, we want people to come in whenever, interrupt each other, and contribute in any which way. So the first issue that I ask of the panel, what do we mean by potential? Is it implying some latent, dormant, hidden skill, attribute, or competency? If so, do we all possess it? And is it a bolus, which may be, for instance, in Churchill, incredible capacity for oratory or leadership or whatever, or is it plastic, and some sort of plastic propensity that requires intermingling with the environment? So is it a bolus, rather like when Michelangelo looked at a lump of stone and said, I can see the Pieta there? Or is it there's something in that lump of stone that can be shaped in many which ways? So first of all, to the panel, how would you define potential? What do we mean by it?
Structured format. Oh, I don't think I'm mic'd up. Can you guys hear me?
Oh, yes.
Wow, my potential to totally startle you. Because you look directly at me and I have the position right here, I'll use the exact same response actually when I was asked in Perth, what is true happiness? So if our potential is really determined by what is it that makes us flourish as human beings, to truly be absolutely who we are is, of course, very relative. But in this example of human flourishing and genuine happiness, the idea is, what are we doing in which we bring to the world versus what are we doing that we take from the world, and do we know the difference? And I think our potential is being able to recognize both what we can bring to the world and what we can take from it in a meaningful way.
Mm-hmm. Whenever I hear questions about potential, I'm often set to wondering about what do we do when we get there, or when we've reached it? Do we just pack up and say, all right, that's it, it's all over? But for me, it's obviously, it's something that's not imposed from externally. It's about unearthing an inherent sort of something that's intrinsic to each of us. And it's emancipatory, as I referred to earlier, and it has to be something that's authentic. And by that I mean, you know, we tell children to believe in themselves and believe that they can be anything they want. And so they make their decisions whether they want to be an NRL superstar or an artist or whatever. And that's fine, but as long as they've taken the time to reflect on the authenticity of that belief about their own potential, and whether or not it's been imposed on them by mum and dad who expects them to be a doctor or something like that, or whether it's a stifled perception or whatever. And interestingly, I'm kind of led to think about great writers, great artists, particularly Aboriginal artists, who produce exceptional quality sort of work that you couldn't at a human conscious level, you couldn't learn to do that stuff. So somehow, I imagine that they've been able to connect with something greater than our sense of being human. And it's like it's come from somewhere else, and then potential is unlimited, really.
Mm-hmm. Any other responses? Michael?
I think that the thought of what are the limits on potential, and what is it? So if we look at like athletic potential, for example, all of us can get faster probably until we can no longer get faster. And then our fasterness goes down as we get older, right? And maybe, you know, with the exception of Daniel, we have limits to our memory. We can get only so much in. It begs the question, because I don't think we're talking about physical potential usually when we're talking about a potential at a conference like this. We're not talking about performance-related things. We're talking about flourishing, unfolding, actually being something or part of something that feels bigger than just a human concern, giving to the world in ways that maybe even can't be mathematically quantified. Like, could anyone describe exactly why that Stradivarius, played by that amazing musician, sounded so much better than you know, Tim's son, who's fantastic, right? But or me, who I stopped playing years ago. We can't quantify some things because it really moves us. And so, really, for me as a scientist, I'm like, what is that dimension where suddenly we stop saying, okay, if you know, we recognize if you do these things, you'll get a little bit faster. We recognize that if you practice some things, you'll be able to use information more so. But if you open yourself as a spiritual being, as a mental being, or emotional being, you kind of can keep going like ripples forever. It's a fascinating question. I'm big on questions, not on answers, by the way.
So far, all the answers have been an individual aspiration. And I just wonder, Chris and Bunker, coming from societies which are much more collectivist rather than individualistic, do you think we should keep the definition at the individual level?
I think it's so important to look at the environment where this individual or community comes from, to bring out the most, the best, the potential of that community. If you take that, if you bring these people into an artificial environment, then you'll never get the full potential of that community. If you create an environment and a space where the full potential is possible, then miracles are achieved. So it's important that you create that environment where they feel that they are in a position to bring out their full potential. And I think that is so important. Sometimes schools and colleges are so limited that you'll never get the full potential. I mean, maybe you're in the wrong place. And when you come out into a different environment and you challenge them into a different space, the full potential comes out and it's miraculous. You see this person blossoming in front of your eyes from a non-person being a human being with tremendous potential. And I think it's so important that you create that environment. And sometimes it never happens, and sometimes it happens by mistake, and sometimes it's just by sheer error that you have created that place.
I'll come back to that. But did you want to add to that?
Yeah, look, I was just reflecting on your question in the context of Aboriginal Australia, and it's often been reported that kind of sense of collectiveness is something that occurs as a cultural thing that is to our detriment and stops us from embracing modernity or those kinds of things. And it's often presented as a kind of stifling sort of binary, when it doesn't need to be presented as such. And it's certainly I see it as a strength, that sense of collectiveness. It's a strength of our kind of sense of cultural identity, but it doesn't exclude our sense of individualism. And the two can coexist. And if we can accept that they are just layers of our sense of overall identity, and then at various points and within various contexts, our sense of collectivism resonates more strongly. And then at other times, our sense of individualism and our aspiration to be exceptional exists as well, but not at the expense of the other. They just exist as different layers of our sense of being Aboriginal and our sense of being human.
Why is reaching our potential so important?
I wanted to go back real quickly
Sure.
to some of the comments that have been made in reflection of your talk, because one of the many things I thought was so striking about it was thinking about those environments, and do you want to be in an environment where everything's given to you? That's great in one way. Do you need to be in an environment where you're going to navigate some things or work collectively or rely on other people and be brought up by other people? And it's so clear that as people, we so falsely create those binaries, and it's good or bad, or it's all of us, or it's just one of us, and things like that.
So I think going back to actually some of the talks from the day before, and I hope I didn't suggest that the best situation is when a child never has to do anything for themselves. But but I think I think maybe Eve and her, if anyone remembers the diagram with the overlapping circles where there was challenge and there was support to meet those challenges versus threat. I think that probably what helps us to reach our potential from an early age is to be challenged, but to know that we have internally or externally the resources to cope with those challenges and to move forward and to explore new ideas and to explore the environment in ways that if we have to take care of more basic needs, we might not be able to get to. When you were asking the collectivist question before, which I know was directed more to that side of the room, but I couldn't help thinking about a business talk that I had heard, and so I'm sorry I don't remember the exact details of the research, but basically this idea that building potential in individual leaders, but also not investing in those leaders unless they were also committed to the idea of building potential in more junior people who could come into leadership roles, actually was able to change some South American countries' economic output 10 years down the road and to build more IT and things like that. So I think even from a very practical kind of economic, maybe I've been living in Singapore too long, but economic stance, building potential probably goes hand in hand both at the individual and the collectivist way, and that you could instill, if part of instilling potential in someone is also instilling the idea that you need to carry that forward, that could be a very important approach.
I'll take it that the potential question about why it's so important has already been covered, that it actually gives meaning to life and so on and so forth. So move to another one. What percentage of people do you think achieve their potential just on the basis of exposure to life experiences? What percentage to serendipity, and what percentage to a structured process? I mean, if we were to generalize and look back over people's lives, how much would we allocate to those three processes? Just that you have to be exposed to life experiences to realize your potential, and that's just the way it happens. Or secondly, that there's some serendipitous event that you build on, or a structured process.
So I think increasingly in child development, there's this notion that lots of people are dandelions. Lots of people can just grow in any environment, and at least in certain domains, they'll just become a dandelion. They'll be a great dandelion, and it doesn't really matter what the soil looks like, et cetera. But there's some people who in certain areas are orchids, and they're much more sensitive to the things around them, and that they, in a good environment, might have the potential to become really amazing in a certain field, but without given those experiences, they don't really become anything. And it's a different way of thinking, I think, about risk and vulnerability to the environment. It's more saying that some people are just more sensitive to their experiences than others, and actually even that's a simplification, because you might be sensitive to a certain set of experience or in a certain capacity and not others.
We find that to bring out the most potential in a person, you have to bring her out of her habitat and challenge them. For instance,
Out of the comfort zone.
out of the comfort zone. For instance, people say, why are you taking a grandmother from this African village into India? Why don't you send a trainer to the community there and train her as an engineer. It's not the same. You have to take her out of a community, out of an environment, and put her into a challenging situation. And that is when the full potential comes out. Very much. Then she has pressures. Oh, the husband says, if you go for 6 months to India, I will take another wife. She's beaten down, and she says, look, forget it. I am going. And she goes for 6 months and comes back and solar electrifies her own village. And the husband has seen this potential, which is awesome. For the first time, she has solar electrified her own village, and the husband says, please come back. But in Burkina Faso, this woman had the same pressure from the husband and saying, look, if you go back, this home is not for you. She says, I'm going in any case. So she goes to India, becomes a solar engineer, comes back and solar electrifies her own village. Then the husband says, come back. And she says, no, I'm quite happy. I'm quite happy as I am. Sorry. I've now got my full potential. Now I'm a solar engineer. I'm respected, highly respected, and I don't need you anymore. So it depends how you treat this person and how you create an environment where she's challenged, she meets other women like her, she sees her global view, and she sees she's not alone. She's feeling this solidarity. So I think the potential of developing a potential of a human being comes when you take her out of her habitat.
So you turned her potential energy into kinetic energy.
Electrical energy.
And then, yes.
Electronic energy.
Yeah, I was thinking of the question and reflecting on your commentary about it's in some ways it's about taking people out of their existing narrative, which could be toxic, and exposing them to a different reality. And I reflect on that in the context of my work at the school. And it's people who know the story know that I got to a point where I said to teachers, look, I've seen enough, and what I believe is our children can leave this school, can leave year 7 ready for high school in year 8. And if you don't believe that, you shouldn't be here. And it sounds, in a dramatic sense, it sounds, interesting. And it was a pretty bitter time. I locked horns with the teachers at the time, trying to get them to see the world in my way. And I was young and loaded with testosterone and fueled by a sense of anger about injustice and all of that kind of thing. But I look back on that time, and I'm more forgiving of the staff that I'd inherited at the school, because they kind of had no reason to believe the things that I was believing. And so it was trying to, because they were stuck in that narrative, and yet if they could have been exposed to a different reality that actually Aboriginal kids could achieve and be high achievers and be exceptional, then they'd have a reason to believe it. But eventually we got, like they made the decision to move on, and we did expose to the whole country a different reality about what's to be had, and the notion that Aboriginal children can be exceptional. And as I look back now, it's a little bit like a kind of, I don't know if people have searched around limestone caves or whatever, but we're stuck in this cave, kind of like that, and it can be toxic in there, and we get to imagining that this is the best that we can do, when there's a little opening up here, and if we have the courage to go through there, then we're exposed to this amazing different reality, and you think, if this was here all the time, then what the hell were we doing back there? And I think that of the teaching profession, we're desperately in search of a kind of a different reality that has integrity, where we can be exceptional with not only with Aboriginal children, but with all children.
I can't remember who came up with the quote, but basically said that we should set our aspirations at the ceiling level, and then when we achieve the ceiling, that becomes our basement. And I think you're implying that, in a sense, that it's on evolving and ever ascending process.
Absolutely, yeah. And if you shoot for the moon and miss, you'll land amongst the stars.
Here we get back to Pluto, Venus. Okay.
I think one of the things about that is I'm really persuaded by arguments that we're basically homeostatic creatures, that we want to have a regular, consistent pattern of inputs, outputs, and we want to have a comfort zone. We want to have a comfort zone, just as a biologically conservative animal who faces risks and all these sorts of things. And it leads to the development of behavioral repertoires that often, for most of us, are very limited. Like the things that we do day in, day out, like not at this conference. But other times, it's very limited, the actual things that we do each day. And they're good, and we actually will be attracted to environments in which we're successful just doing those things. That's not potential, that's just practice, that's routine. So it is this time, you know, who among us here thinks that they're a latent social engineer, but latent solar engineer, or a latent like school transformer? You know, we don't think that until we're at that point where we say, oh, I've got to learn some new skills, and we realize, oh, I can actually learn new skills. I can become a completely different life here. And I think you can look at it as just, our system wants to just sit. It's so inviting.
To build on that, I'd love to speak on serendipity, having no research background in it whatsoever, and only life experience. And building both on this idea of our predispositions in terms of what life prepares us for. Is my microphone on?
We shouldn't ask the people in the front, we should ask that lady up there, right?
Okay. All right. So the idea being about serendipity and what role. We've had folks now cover the other topics here of being able to maybe push your comfort zone a little, what your predispositions may be, and again, maybe our homeostatic preference, our desire to just be stable. I think the opportunities that present themselves to us, we have to be prepared for. I think the early life experiences indeed can prepare us to explore the world. We have to feel as though we have some sense of, if we go out there and take serendipitous opportunities, that we'll land and feel good about them. This is an incredible trait and skill to have, one I think there's not enough research on. I've been very lucky to have serendipitous opportunity. I was forced into teaching the Cultivating Emotional Balance teacher training with 1.5 weeks of preparation. And if anyone saw my presentation yesterday, I've now been teaching it for 4 years and going into the 5th. It was a serendipitous opportunity that came out of a difficult situation where my father was very sick. They needed someone to teach. I was already slated to go as an observer. Now, if I hadn't felt safe in the world, some sort of comfort, I would have said, heck no, that is setting me up for failure. That is the craziest idea, to stand in for a world's expert at 29 years old and try and teach a whole load of professionals about their own emotional life. And yet, it was awesome, an incredible opportunity, life-changing in terms of research in my path. So I guess I'll speak with the serendipity or luck and say that the serendipity and luck is everywhere. And we have to open our eyes and be willing maybe to push the comfort zone as suggested.
So are you saying, Eve, that we should accept all opportunities, and then if they're no good, we get out fast, but some of them may turn out to be very positive?
Hopefully we have some good evaluation capacities as to what are good and bad opportunities, right? But indeed, I think if an opportunity looks appealing, we shouldn't let our own kind of desires to maybe retreat into what is a safety zone for us, or what is expected from an external force or pressure societally or within an education system of what's a norm.
Because my own personal experience is I couldn't have predicted many events that I had the opportunity to take up or not. The ones that I took up that turned out to be positive, many of them I would never have predicted them to be positive. So my basic view is as I said, accept all invitations. If it's not good, get out as fast as you can. What I'd like to ask next is how we can pick up people's potential and break it up into the first 10 years, into adolescence and adulthood. This may be hard, and people have quite varying wisdom on this. Perhaps the best piece of wisdom that I've come across was Billy Connolly, who basically said, find out what is your passion, what gets you up in the morning, and he felt that could be picked up in young children. So let's just stick with the first 10 years. What would you be looking for in a child in their first 10 years that might give you some indication of their potential?
I think that one thing that's just very important is to think about imagination and play. And right now, my son wants to be an astronaut. I have no idea if by encouraging him to think about space and flying, he's going to act. I mean, we don't even have a space program anymore.
And Pluto's gone with it.
But I think that just building on whatever a child is interested in and being supportive of it, but also having them do this kind of pretend play is probably very good for frontal functioning, for areas of the brain that are going to be important for other forms of potential later in life, because imagination and play, it's like homework for kids. It's telling them, hold this one thing in your mind right now, where you really are and where someone else really is, and now at the same time, think about yourself and that other person in an entirely different context, and inhibit all of the things that have to do with the one so that you can act and play out the other. And you can think about that in terms of coping, in terms of mental energy, and later that practicing that in a way that's fun is actually good for later experiences. That's kind of my thought.
So, and you're suggesting that the young kid who lives in a bubble of make-believe and play, that would be a good signal for you, a world of imagination.
I would want to encourage a world of imagination for, I think, everyone.
Right. Can we add any other factors in young children?
I must say, I think of a very different world here. Millions and millions of children don't even go to school. And their only thing they look forward to is a place when they can go to a school. And they can learn how to read and write. The first 10 years, if you're talking about children, they like to stay in a place where they feel that they're a part of a larger mainstream. They feel that they're in a school where they can learn how to read and write. That is such an important gift that we can give them, that we don't give them enough. We're talking about the many people who are already in school. What about the millions who don't go to school? They are the ones we really need to address. And they have some such simple dreams. They have such simple things. You ask them, what do you want? What do you look for? What is your dream? 1 square meal a day. I want to learn how to read and write. I want to make sure that I am a better citizen in my village. Now, we can't even meet those dreams. I mean, it's very sad because you're addressing a problem which is so serious that we're looking at, staring at us in the face, but we're just not even addressing it enough. Mm-hmm. To me, that is an issue. Millions and millions of children who don't go to school, who are exploited, who are sexually exploited. Mm-hmm. What about these people? You know, we need to address them. We're just not doing enough for that.
But I hear within your answer that even within those children, that there are those who have a set of priorities, some quite adult, almost generative in many ways.
A meal a day, please let me come to a school rather than get drinking water 10 kilometers away from a well.
Yep.
I'm spending half my time trying to get firewood for my.
Sure.
You know, these are basics which are taken for granted.
Okay, Chris, what would you look for in a young child in the first 10 years to know that they had some potential to be worthy of perhaps investing somewhat more?
Yeah, I'm a bit with Ian and her notions of just making it okay for children to believe whatever it is they want to. But as long as there's some authenticity about that, and as long as it's not stifled by other people's limited perceptions of who this child can be and what they are. Mm-hmm. You know, the earlier things I talked about, I think that becomes obvious. Yes.
All right. What about adolescence? I mean, every parent has an adolescent who's finishing school at some stage, in the third world country accepted, and you know, the kid isn't sure what they should do, the parent isn't necessarily sure. What are the signals that we might look for in adolescence to help shape them in the directions they may go?
I feel strongly compelled to disrupt things just a bit.
Good.
So it's okay.
This is adolescent rebellion.
Yeah,
Is it?
yeah, sorry, yeah. Just ask me, I'm a prematurely gray 17-year-old. Well, I always think about this stuff. So what are we here for today? What are all of us here for today? Are we here to accumulate some stuff so that we're better off and screw the rest of the world? Do we care about potential just because my potential makes me feel better, or I earn more money, or whatever it is? I mean, In the US, we have a phrase, maybe it's here too, who gives a rat's ass? About potential, happiness, meaning, all these sorts of things, unless it's about bigger things, right? Unless it's about giving more kids opportunities. That's our real collective potential, isn't it? Like, how do we, I don't know, jump out of our own seats, jump out of our concerns, like make the world a place where people can be free, but then and think and dream, which I think is super important. And if I'm thinking of, I thought the same thing you did, Anne and Chris, like let's let kids play more, but then, oh my gosh, right? So yeah, kids are walking miles and miles to do things that we no longer even think about in our lives because it's done by our system we live in. And what is the deal, right? So like, how do we, that's what potential should be really. It should be, how do we fit in with some solutions and making changes? And I think when you ask kids, when I ask at least my kids, right, or kids in my kids' schools, they're like, they want to help. That's what they think. They want to play. And so like, why go to space? Because you find aliens, you make friends, and like the world is peaceful. You know, it's like almost always comes back to these beautiful dreams of sharing once those basic needs are met. So an adolescent's potential, when we see these inspiring kids, we see kids who are like, I'm not going to fight with teachers just for myself because it feels good. I'm going to open up a world of possibility for other people too. So I mean, that feels a little bit like a rant. Actually, that's probably the definition of a rant.
You weren't angry enough.
Yeah. Right? Yeah, but I don't know.
I think at the beginning of the rant, you were making a point about cultural differences, and I think America we would probably see as more individualistic. We have the fantasy in the old days of the Berkeley self-actualizing student, which was very individualistic. We know the 3 inalienable rights in the Declaration of Independence, where Benjamin Franklin changed the pursuit of money to the pursuit of happiness. So I think many of us would see American as individualistic, but nevertheless, whether it's individualistic or for the community, I'd sort of like to come back to the question, how do we assess in adolescence, what are the signals that adolescents may manifest? If we accept for the moment in young children, it may be an imagination and playfulness. What are the little signals of some latent attribute that might be polished and actualized?
I guess I'd continue on the rant a little bit and suggest I was so fortunate to work with adolescents only for about 4 or 5 years in a clinical setting as a social worker. And there's a wonderful quote, and I don't remember who it's by, that when you're 20, you're not idealistic, you have no heart. And if by your 30s, you're still idealistic, you have no brain. And I think that's the wrong idea. I think the potential is so innate at adolescence to care, to want to connect, to be interested in other people, to want to change the world, to have a huge vision. So the question isn't how do we assess them? It's how do we allow that bubble of true kind of caring and concern to really have a place, to it not to be, okay, are you going to be a good engineer or are you actually going to be better at marketing? What do we think you are going to do potentially in terms of your role in the workforce? But how do we maintain this idea that people still can, should, and would maybe be of use, be of help in the world? I was quite a challenging adolescent. I was describing to another speaker yesterday that I was so disappointed by the amount of suffering in the world and that we weren't doing enough. I was very, very upset about that. It made me feel like I needed to kind of disregard everyone and everything, and that was really meaningful to me. And I guess continuing on the rant, how do we help adolescents think that that is a good ideal, a positive ideal, something we can truly within ourselves believe is true, and collectivistic, individualistic, either way, harness and foster that. So.
Right. I think that's operating at the high level. If we take the Marty Seligman model that having a job is better than no job, and having a career is better than a job, and having a calling is better than a career. Let's go back to adolescents who have to make a choice about getting a job and having a career. And we can, I guess, also come back to Anne's point about orchids and so on. So that the point I'm making is that each individual will have some propensities, but then there's also the capacity to find their ecological niche or not. And if they don't find that ecological niche, whatever propensities they may have may not flourish. So how do we address this at the adolescent level? What are the signals we're looking for? how do we detect their propensities, their strengths?
I'm thinking of one thing that, at least in my mind, kind of blends a lot of this, which is exposure to different cultures and different people. You ask, if you want to encourage a child's own interests, an adolescent's own interest, but if it's someone who has never met a solar engineer or someone who's even finished university or who is, I mean, hopefully that's not the case, but a good and caring person, how do they know to dream about even doing that? So, I mean, that might be not an identification, but helping a child themselves to identify who they want to be, to just increased exposure to the problems in the world, but also people who are making differences and in many different ways.
So exposure, I hear, is one important aspect. What else, Michael?
What do they really want to spend their time doing? Like, what are they doodling about, other than video games and puberty-related activities? What are they really spending their time thinking about dreaming? Because we saw from the video of the orchestra, right, that if I've got a bunch of violins and trumpets, well, how is that going to solve problems? Oh wait, there's ways to solve problems with trumpets and violins. So if a kid wants to draw or do fashion or wants to do hardcore science or just wants to play sport, that's what they want to do. That's going to be their potential. Let them run with it and keep alive that dream that they can do something powerful with it.
So I don't hear suggestions such as, okay, if they're left brain dominant, then they're more likely to, be successful and realise their potential in certain areas, and if they're right brain dominant. I'm not hearing answers like that.
We did hear if they're no brain dominant. I didn't mean to gesture towards your head, this one, I guess.
So I can give a kind of, I think, funny example. My boss at work, it's a very famous scientist, Michael J. Meany, who's done a lot of psychiatric epigenetics. And he was telling me that his mentor basically had a rule that if an application came in where all of the grades were good, it immediately got chucked into the basket. The bin, right, the trash bin. It was only when he saw lots and lots of bad grades, but good grades in very specific fields, that he thought, this is someone with the passion to continue doing this, to ask questions. This is someone who has decided, I might not be good at everything, right? I just don't care about that stuff, but I'm really going to be good at the thing that I'm going to be good at. And I think that might have a lesson for adolescents in general, getting back to what everyone is kind of saying, is to help them figure out what it is that they like and to thrive at that. And they might be terrible at something else. There's lots and lots of things I'm terrible at, but I try really hard to be good at this one little thing that I do.
I think that's a lovely answer. But again, coming back to you, Chris, because as a headmaster in the past, what did you see in adolescence that you found helpful signals?
Yeah, look, during the conversation, I'm just reflecting on a young guy who was at the school when I was at Cherbourg some years ago, and I was there a few months ago, and he's a young 19-year-old. His name's Jackson. And I remember him very well at the school because I left the school when he was in grade 4. He was the smartest kid in the whole school. Yet when we left, he went on this kind of downward sort of spiral and a really awful trajectory. And it threw me to run into him again. I said, "What have you been up to?" And he said, "Oh, Mr. Sarra, I've been doing a lot of drugs, man." And he had a tough life. But what he said, "But I remember the strong and smart stuff that you talk to us about all the time." And it doesn't have to be reflected in a successful life, but if it was something that kept him alive, because I know that there are other kids who we didn't spend a long time with who made a drastic choice to take their own lives. And I think if you can just instill a sense of worth in kids to keep those embers flickering to the extent that they realise they're good enough to stay alive and embrace a sense of hope, then that will do it for me.
Mm-hmm. I think it's so important to find out what their role models are. In India, if you ask them what you want to be, and they'll want to be a film star. They'll want to be a soccer player. I said, do you want to be a Gandhi? Gandhi, who? It's a very important indicator of how the youngster is exposed to what they think should be their role model. And I think this is a dangerous sign when you get to the elders and you ask them, who do you want to be? And they always want to be someone who's famous, someone who's got money, someone who's got security, someone. And if you're working for a community, you're a loser. You know, you've got no money, you've got no security. What the hell are you doing in a community? So sometimes it's so important to expose these youngsters to the right role models. And this is a very challenging situation for lots of young people.
Okay, maybe if I could just ask one final question, see if any of you like to take it up. How do we know when we're making the most of our potential?
When we feel really happy.
Yeah, it's hard to argue with that. When there's a genuine sense of authenticity about who we are and what we've achieved, and knowing that I'm being the truth about who I am, and I'm playing my part in being the best I can be in the world.
Right. So let's just pursue happy a little bit more. Happy in the sense that there's been some reward, or more at the well-being level.
Yeah.
There's been an impact at a wider, outside of oneself.
Yeah, I should have been less impulsive and just let Chris answer it. It was a much better answer.
That's okay.
I think we've all got agreement on that.
Yeah.
So we've mastered the topic. We know all the answers. We know how to achieve our potential, and therefore we can now go off and have lunch, which is potentially good.
You went through early adolescence and then think about, we didn't get right to the end, and I was thinking of Ruth Cracknell. Some of you guys won't know her show, Mother and Son, and
Yep.
she had a set of golf clubs under her bed, and her son was saying, "Why the hell are you keeping this all the time?" She said, "I might be an exceptional golfer." He said, "Well, you've never played." And she said, "Well, so how do you know then?" Sorry,
So on your behalf, I'll thank Bunker, Chris, Eve, Michael and Anne for a very informative session. Thank you.